master, Sergei, asked me not to live up to the reputation of my countrymen. And since I'm from Germany, you know what it means. And obviously, as you all know, we all put a lot of work in this, so he asked me to be a little bit kind and gentle on time. Nevertheless, I'll give the speakers a little 5-minute warning before we approach 15 minutes. And I'll give another one 1 minute before the end of 15 minutes, so that we nevertheless try to do it at least a little bit the German way, or the American, as I learned from Maureen. And since there's one colleague, Naim, missing, we have a little change in the row of our speakers. We'll begin with Emily, and then we'll listen to Tim and Rod, and we will conclude with the two presentations from Samaras and where is Neofytos? Well, he will be here right now. So, without any further delay, Emily, the stage is all yours.
Great.
I don't know.
You can use one if you'd like. It's not on though, just flip the switch. Oh, sorry, it's on the side, yeah.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Emily Blout. I'm from American University in the School of Communication. And I want to thank you guys for a great conference. I really enjoyed this. My background is in history. I'm a historian. PhD in history and a PhD in Iranian history in particular. So I've been looking at, for the past 4 years, I've been looking at the history of the Iranian mass communication sector in Iran. And that's what I'm writing my present book about, that's what I wrote my dissertation about, and that is really my expertise. However, I have a couple of side projects. And this is kind of a side project that keeps on coming up in my research. And it's a theme that it's not only recurring for me in my research in the context of Iran, but also now we see in American politics. So I'm presenting a very, very early version, beginning stages of my thinking on this subject. So I really would appreciate feedback and ideas in terms of how to go about doing my research. What I'm going to give to you today is basically more of a literature review and a preliminary argument. Okay? But before I do that, I just want to begin by starting with a story. I was driving in my car listening to NPR, and it was February 2016, and I heard this guy come on the radio. His name is Michael Lumpkin. And he came on and he was talking to the NPR hosts about his new center within the State Department. And he basically said that, this is what he said, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to truly recognize that the threat has evolved. And we need to evolve and get ahead of it, not just in the battlefield, but also in the information space as well. Well, I came into this probably halfway through the program, but I come to learn that this is their new counter-propaganda center within the State Department. And this is Michael Lumpkin coming on and saying that we're basically doing away with a program that was what he called tweeting at terrorists. That was the program that he was going to replace by a new model. What is this program? So, of course, I look it up, and I find that this is a new iteration of an earlier program. And I find a very similar interview from a man named Alberto Fernandez. And he was appointed the original head of the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. This is the prologue to this organization that Michael Lumpkin heads. And that was in 2011. And he says, this is some of the most difficult, dangerous, and ungoverned space of all. You can't just leave it to the enemy. He's talking about cyberspace. So this is where kind of the idea and the quandary. I have a master's from the National Defense University in international strategy, basically, strategic thought. And I have also done various stints at the Pentagon as a fellow in doing Middle Eastern issues. And so I have seen this on many different levels, not just as an academic, but also as a practitioner or someone at least familiar with the field. And so this is the subject of my inquiry. It is this understanding that, well, what is propaganda? And is it just propaganda that has changed? Is it just the battlefield that has changed? Or, perhaps is it the way that we do propaganda that needs to change? So I want to begin by just saying, talking about definitions of propaganda and trying to answer these questions. So in 1925, Edward Bernays defined propaganda as the consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group. In 2011, Gareth Jowett and Victoria O'Donnell, I think they were actually cited yesterday, defined propaganda as the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perception, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. So that seems pretty neutral to me, pretty neutral. But despite these decidedly broad and largely neutral definitions, the word propaganda in the United States tends to have a pejorative connotation. And it tends to be used in reference to the enemy and foreign governments, as opposed to certain individuals or groups within the government and commercial sector. So what is propaganda? How can propaganda be identified and differentiated from other types of influence in today's globalized, hybrid, hyper-mediated security environment? Or has the term lost its relevance? So, this is my argument. So just as it is accepted that the US military is engaged in new war, and that victory requires winning the hearts and minds of a subject population, it should be increasingly apparent that the battlefield is not confined to foreign publics and foreign lands. America is equally susceptible. Rather than fake news or alternative facts, some of the information disseminated during the 2016 election and some of the news information that is circulating today might be more accurately called propaganda. So I want to talk a little bit about the etymology of propaganda. I'm a historian, so I always have to go back to the past, start at the beginning, right? So the modern word propaganda is derived from the Latin verb propagare, meaning to propagate, to disseminate, or to spread. And in other words, it also refers to the planting of fresh roots into the earth to reproduce and take on a life of their own. That's the original context of the word. So this is not an unreasonable analogy for promoting and growing new ideas and values, wouldn't you say? Pretty reasonable. So then I went to the Oxford English Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary defines propaganda as any association, systematic scheme, or concerted movement for the propagation of a particular doctrine or practice, carried out by an interested party, especially in a tendentious way, in order to encourage or instill a particular attitude or response. Okay. So the Congressional Research Service used this definition in a report on executive agency activity in 2005. And the investigation was in response to a number of controversies regarding the conduct of executive agencies of the Bush administration, as well as agencies of certain federal departments, such as the FBI and the EPA, so the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency. And they had this complaint. This is their complaint about this definition. This definition is quite broad and not especially helpful in the present context, since it captures any coordinated activity aimed at persuading others of the wisdom and the veracity of one's ideas and positions, something that is part and parcel of politics and governance. I would agree. Indeed, one can argue that politics and the functioning of democratic governance depends on communication persuasion. In a system that is ruled by consensus and consent of the people, it is vitally important that citizens and public servants alike engage in public sharing of ideas and information in order to mobilize public opinion in favor of one action or policy. So the self-proclaimed founder of public relations, Edward Bernays, made the case for this, the use of media to shape public opinion and engender change in his article called The Engineering of Consent. And he says that communication is key to engineering of consent for social action. There's a long quote here that I'm going to skip because I was told I just had 5 minutes, but what I'm trying to get at here is that in the absence of consensus, the government would be unable to adapt to the changing wills and prerogatives of government. If the government does not adapt to social change, it risks losing its claims to legitimacy. So despite the necessity of propaganda as we know it, why isn't it used in American politics? Indeed, elected officials take pains to disavow the practice, conflating the practice of propaganda with the practice of publicity and public communication in legislation and federal statute. In particular, 53107, which was passed in 1913, prohibits the use of appropriated funds to pay a publicity expert unless specifically appropriated for that purpose. While the language of the annual appropriations bills, such as PL 108447, prohibits the recipient agency from using funds for, quote, propaganda and publicity. So if propaganda is, as the Oxford English Dictionary calls it, any coordinated activity aimed at persuading others of the wisdom and veracity of their ideas and positions, then why isn't this word used in politics and in American discourse? And I argued in my initial literature review that I saw that the pejorative connotation of propaganda in the US, and I would say also in much of Europe, has to do a lot with its history. And it came, a lot of the pejorative use of it came with the populations of America and Europe being exposed to state-sponsored media in the context of World War and Cold War and mass media platforms, primarily radio and later television. So this period, the war periods of World War I and II and up to through the Cold War, this featured the rise of these powerful nation states that had both the means to wield new communication technologies and the political imperative of disseminating its ideology en masse. States sought to monopolize the realm of media in their societies on foreign battlefields. So, for instance, in the Soviet Union, socialist realism. The Soviet Union proclaimed socialist realism as the only acceptable type of art in 1932, and Stalin proclaimed, he made this proclamation on the reconstruction of literary and art organizations. In Nazi Germany, under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, the Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda was established, and it was a central disseminator of all print and broadcast content and sought to control and house any artistic and literary endeavors. And I think, continued on that reasoning, another reason for the pejorative connotation relates to the religious origins of the word. And this is particular, I think to the US, but I could be wrong. The term originated in Europe in 1622 with the formulation of a body called Sacra Congregato de Propaganda Fide. So that's Sacred College for the Propagating of the Faith. And the body was established by Pope Gregory for the purpose of training priests bound for missions in non-Catholic territories abroad. The purpose of the propaganda was evangelical and relating to proselytizing bodies' mission in foreign lands. So in this early usage, it was state-sponsored, and it was a religious activity oriented to foreign publics for the purpose of achieving domination of one's ideology, and for its accompanying economic and political system over all others. So another reason would be the nature of mass communication environment in general. The fact that mass communication in the United States is a private and commercial entity, it's part of the political economy of media, and which was born in the 20th century. I'm going to skip over this, but relevant thinkers on this point would be Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. So here's my argument that this is where I'm getting at here. Just as we look at the historical context in which American political conception of propaganda was fostered, we must look at the contemporary environment and more recent experience to understand how this conception has changed or how it stayed the same. So just returning to my argument that America must revise its propaganda to better reflect the contemporary media environment, we need to look at what we call new media. And we also need to look at what we call new war. So very quickly, media scholarship generally reflects a consensus on that about the change in the media landscape today from paradigms of the past. So from this old media paradigm to a new media paradigm. So I'm just going to fast forward because I'm told that I have very few minutes left, but seconds left. But I'm gonna take a little bit more. So basically, here's some differences between old war and new war, and I won't go into those. But old war is basically using force to get an opponent to achieve your will, and new war is, which is harder to find, is aimed at public opinion. So here's some examples of the kind of propaganda that I've been looking at as kind of evidence, or at least now anecdotal evidence, but perhaps artifacts of what I'm talking about in the change. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. One of them is a text message. It was a WeChat message disseminated among my students. Some are in Venezuela, some are in Colombia, some are in Puerto Rico, and basically it's misinformation about the most recent executive order. And then another one is a tweet by the supreme leader of Iran using the Battle of Waterloo to make a point about Iranian culture and politics. And then finally this one, which is, this was on the billboard of the main thruway in Tehran, sponsored by the US, by the Iranian government. And as you can see, it's a very detailed and thought out mimic replication of something that we hold sacred, the U.S. holds sacred. So to what extent are these propaganda pieces? And if so, these look similar to the things that are going on in our neighborhood today. So those are just some original preliminary thoughts about this and questions I
have. Since the popular vote is not that much respected in America these days, I was wondering to get a quick feedback from the audience. Shall we have questions now, or shall we? Because I already see Greg raising his hand. So maybe 2 quick questions, and then we move on. Please.
Okay, I think when you're talking about propaganda and its use being so controversial, I think this can be found in the value that it kind of, especially in a Western society, violates the notion of the free will of man by tricking them, if you like, into a certain line of thought and behaviour. And of course, Lipman and Bernays absolutely go along these lines with not only propaganda but public opinion research. I would say that also propaganda is always projected as something that democracies don't do. It's what the other side does. But if you look historically, democracies have been the best at it. And if you look at Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler devotes a nice little glowing section where he praises British propaganda from the First World War. And Goebbels had a lot of respect for the likes of Edward Bernays. So you have these rather uncomfortable connections and these kind of perceptions.
I would Samaras first and then Aspriadis.
Actually, propaganda is the persuasion of the enemy. So the other side is the enemy who's doing propaganda, while we are doing persuasion. It's as simple as this. The term propaganda, employing the term propaganda, we are involved into an act of propaganda. So the term propaganda is using propagandistic reasons. And this is the only difference in the concept. So if they're the enemy, then they're doing propaganda.
So it's where it's directed.
Hmm?
It's where the message is directed.
No, if he's the enemy, if I disagree with something, it is propaganda. If I agree with something, it's persuasion. Because I have the truth, and they are the lie, they are lying. Because I lie while they're not me.
Okay, so it's a rhetorical device, so that doesn't have any,
exactly.
So it doesn't have any utility as a heuristic.
There is, because it's a loaded term employed to delegitimize. It is a tool of delegitimation. It's a meta-communicative narrative that deconstructs the legitimacy, the intentionality, and all other things. And it is heavily involved and generated by blame games. Propaganda has been essential to convey the image of all powerful media, and this is very useful in gameplay, because if it's the enemy's propaganda they did, German generals after the First World War, we didn't lose the war. Big propaganda lost the war for us. Same thing with the Vietnam syndrome in the States. We didn't lose the war. The war. Media lost the war for us. Same argumentation. Only difference is the independence of the media. But it conveys the projection of all powerful media, all powerful enemy, which is very useful in order because if the communication is you play the fault in communication, then it's not your fault for being incompetent.
Okay, last question. I hope it turns not into another co-presentation.
It's actually not a question; it's a comment. I think the problem of application of Bernays and Lippmann and even Goebbels or Soviet methodology of propaganda from the Cold War to the interactive environment that is presented by current media is the core here. It's much more important than definitions and so on, because the problem with traditional propaganda that has been created during the World War I and was grossly mastered in the Cold War, is it's not based on broadcast anymore. It's what Edward Murrow called the last free feed, but these are last free digital feed. It's the last free tweets, I think, now. And to understand how it works, it's important to take in account the psychology of immediacy and immediate interactivity that social networks bring into this discourse, which has nothing to do with the traditional mechanics of propaganda that, well, Liebman was thinking that it works, and we see reflected in opinion polls, and opinion polls affect political line, blah, blah, blah. I mean, now it affects immediate reaction, today. That's my
So then the State Department's efforts, or U.S. efforts on this, on counter propaganda, are bound to fail because it's not in nature.
Not only,
I think
not
what he's
only,
saying is they're bound to fail if you constantly have to go back up the chain of command and wait 3 or 4 hours in order to get an approval to tweet something.
but on the other hand, the worst thing that can happen is to work like Geoffrey Piant, the ambassador in Ukraine, who tweeted, just look at the amount of his tweets. During Ukrainian events, he tweeted about 70,000 tweets. I mean, he commented on every single word Russians said, Ukrainians said, and so on. This is the worst thing American diplomacy ever did.
Well, we'll take that as a final comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we continue now with Tim Ticker, and we're staying with enemies. The presentation is entitled Dissuading the Enemy, How Context, Content, and Connection Can Influence Adversary Decisions and Actions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Able to hear me? No? Okay, there we go. That sounds a lot better. I'd like to begin by just thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this forum. I'm going to be sharing with you, it's a conceptual planning, communications planning framework that I've been working on with a couple of colleagues. Would like to kind of see this as a dialogue or a conversation. Would love to get your thoughts, your input, your expertise and insights on the planning framework. I'm going to build on a few of the concepts that Emily was talking about, very much kind of the hearts and minds arena for those who have an information warfare or a PSYOPs background. If you come out of that background, then you should recognize a number of the core concepts and principles. I personally, for the last 25 years, have been in the risk and crisis communications, crisis management arena, broadly, and with specialized expertise around what we would describe as kind of high threat, high consequence types of events. I have been involved in the national security, the homeland security arena, whether it is bioterrorism and anthrax or the Ebola outbreak. I come from kind of a public health preparedness background as well, and have been more recently involved in active shooter types of events. So a lot of emergency management, emergency response, and the application of strategic communications principles and concepts in these various arenas. I want to share with you just very quickly. Again, it's very much in the formative stages. Would love to get your input on the definition, the objectives, the audiences, the core elements of the framework. Show you a couple of possible scenarios, and then the application that we're using it primarily in the homeland security, as well as the emergency preparedness and response. Just starting with the definition, really two components here, strategically as well as tactically. Strategically, we're talking about a holistic approach for assessing and communicating detailed and organized responses to each element in an adversary targeted strategies and messages. And so we're essentially talking about the adversary's broader communications infrastructure and enterprise consisting of who are their messengers, who are their media, and the channels that they're using. And then to Emily's point about hearts and minds, having a better understanding of the mindset and the motivation behind that enterprise. And then more tactically, once we have an understanding of that, using that as the foundation, then we also want to be able to think through the various threat scenarios that they are envisioning, kind of a best case, worst case, and most probable case type of scenario, and then what are the consequences for each of those scenarios, and then from there, using that as the foundation on which we are going to begin developing our messaging and communications content. What are the channels? What is going to be the combination of the print, the broadcast media? How are we going to monitor and track those communications as well, and then creating a central repository for that information. What are the objectives? Well, we start with a concept around risk. There's really four major dimensions of risk. The first being the threat itself, the second being the probability, the third being the vulnerability, and the fourth being the consequences. And we're interested in all four of those elements in the context of the adversary. We then want to look at their sphere of influence, or the center of gravity, in terms of the audiences. In the next slide, I'll be talking about that. I think yesterday's keynote speaker, Eric Diesenhall, made a very important point about it's not just about audiences, but probably the more strategic consideration is this notion of constituencies. And the concept behind that is that they have a vested interest in not only the process and the outcome. So it's not enough just to identify our audiences. We have to really understand what are the vested interests of each of those audiences, and then tapping into those. And then from a process perspective, the concept of pattern interrupt, the ultimate endpoint that we're trying to get at is behavior, ultimately changing behaviors. And I have to agree with Emily's observation that the objectives around propaganda, you can find these in political circles, religious circles, everywhere. So in terms of process, there's also some pretty good research around what we would describe as the 4 R's. There's adversary readiness, adversary response, adversary recovery, and adversary resilience. And we need to understand those 4 dimensions of the adversary in terms of where we want to target the actual communications. The audiences, 3 major audiences. The adversary himself or herself also have audiences. There are the allies of the adversary, the antagonists of the adversary, and then the agnostics of the adversary. And if you look at the split of these 3 audiences, it's about 20 and 60% being the agnostics, and this tracks very well in the political arena. And the corollary for agnostics is the undecided voter, and that's really the kind of the untapped resource that we need to be thinking about. And going back to our allies, essentially 2 types of relationships. There's the transactional relationship and the symbolic relationship. An example of the transactional relationship are the participants in any type of criminal enterprise, and you can further split that out into two types of partners. It's going to be an operational partner and a capital partner. The operational partner are those individuals or organizations who are providing types of in-kind contributions, equipment, materials. The capital partner are those that are providing the funding behind the organization, and then more symbolically, those who have a kind of a shared worldview and ideology. And adversary antagonists, these are the competitors, right? This is essentially a market. It's a market space. And when you're in that space, you're going to find that you also have competitors. And so the competition is the vying for publicity, resources, supporters, and recruits. And we can also refer to this particular audience as the competitor and antagonists. The agnostics, these are the undecided. They can really go either way, depending on how they are influenced. So if you think about, put them on a spectrum from most uncertain to highly certain, and then there's everybody in between. What we have to think about from a communications perspective is the potential for mobilization, for recruitment. I think somebody earlier had described this as our group of moderates. So what's the role of adversary-based communications in reaching and influencing this type of audience? So if we bring it back to strategy for the allies of the adversary, we would want to think about ways, how can we use communication to kind of create and sow tension and discontent and disaffection. For the antagonists of the ally, we want to kind of give them voice, strengthen that voice and their arguments against the adversary. And then finally with the agnostics, how can we think about them in terms of the intervention or the intervening of recruitment and mobilization? Here's a lot of text here for you, kind of three major components: context, content, and connection. In the area of assessment, have really already kind of spoken about this. We need to get a much better understanding of the audience, their communications infrastructure, the operational risks, and the vulnerabilities, what their motivations and intentions are, and what might be some of the competing narratives. Then once having that as our baseline or the foundation, then thinking about from a communications perspective, what are going to be some of the mitigation strategies. And there's a couple of subtopics here around the use of another ABC kind of construct around the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences. There's good research around the antecedents in terms of the circumstances, the conditions, the resources that can help drive attitudes and behaviors. Then what are the actual behavior endpoints that we are interested in? And then looking at the consequences, both intended, unintended, and unanticipated. And then the triggers are extremely important because there's no better way to say this other than just to read it. It's activating positive and or negative behavioral triggers, including associative and disassociative words, symbols, memes, and cultural myths, mnemonics to increase the ease of use, reuse, referral, and repetition of information and images and visuals to accelerate the rate at which these themes are communicated, acted upon, and then retained. And then connection and just the kind of the core themes and messages. Here's a couple of quick scenarios that we are in the process of developing. Weapons of mass destruction, and one of our other colleagues earlier today was talking about the use of loss frames to either incentivize or disincentivize, to motivate, demotivate, to see what we can do in terms of impacting the concept of efficacy, success or lack of success thereof in terms of the efforts. And then finally, the applications that we're looking at, that communications in the world that I'm in, there's essentially an operational component and a communications component, ensuring that the communications component is integrated into a broader operational response, planning response, whether it's in the context of law enforcement, intelligence gathering, and homeland security. I've been for years involved in a number of national and regional preparedness exercises, drills, and simulations, and we're using this type of approach in this broader type of planning scenario. Message develop and dissemination, I've already spoken about that, really developing your suite of products and communication strategies, whether it's scenarios for pre-scripted messaging, the actual production of those messages in various formats, and in ensuring a central repository, and then where we can in a surrogate type of format or situation where we can actually test these messages, and we're able to do that in the context of these national exercises, drills, and simulation. So again, very, very quick, very broad overview. Would be interested, I guess, a couple things. One is inputs, insights on the approach, the model itself, and then obviously in the context of this conference, where you would see the application of this approach or this model or this framework around character assassination. So, gotta get it done?
Since you're 2 minutes ahead of time, we have time for 3 questions at least. And so Richard first, and Emily, and then Greg.
Yeah, Tim, it's great to see the focus on the agnostics. And I'm curious, especially, it's come up a couple times so far this weekend in terms of desensitization. Sometimes when people just don't know what to think, they're paralyzed and maybe they become disaffected. And I see you mentioned in terms of agnostics, keeping them from getting recruited. So I'm wondering what kind of additional measures and hurdles in that effort might be involved in not just keeping them from getting recruited, but perhaps to get them on the side of opposing, the bad actors out there. And what
Well, I think it's what we are seeing. We have to really triangulate our three audiences and exercise the influence from all 3 of those audiences: the antagonist, and especially the allies, and identify where the spheres of influence are around those audiences. Who do they perceive as credible information sources? Not an easy task, but that's really the work that has to get done in order to answer that.
Just a clarification, and thank you for this presentation, it's really interesting. But clarification is, so I was looking at your scenarios, and it says cyber terrorism, for example, in the cyber terrorism scenario. So you would apply this construct to a challenge or threat in the practical world to disrupt or influence a would-be cyber terrorist.
Yes.
And
Right.
prevent, and that's
Right. I mean, it's essentially applying finding the application of this approach from kind of the message conception, the production, and then obviously identifying those bad actors in that particular arena.
so the assumption would be that you can interrupt that kind of behavior.
Yeah, with a lot of kind of groundwork, a lot of work has to be done in terms of actually identifying
But it's
those.
possible,
Yes.
and you know it's possible.
One of the things that I've noted with the communication and interaction with the adversary, it's been too Western-centric and a little, self-deluded, to put it frankly. For example, this whole, you should use Daesh, you should not use ISIS, you need to sort of character assassinate them by this way. Or, for example, one of the things, all of those ISIS recruits, they're just these uneducated religious ones from the countryside, which they're absolutely not. The guys who are going into ISIS are usually from rich families, they're highly educated, they're highly motivated because they are driven by certain senses of injustice and these other points. And while you're sort of saying, that these are not too much of a threat because this is who they are, you miss your target audience. You can't communicate with people if you're not communicating in the right tone and sense.
Yeah, I think that also if you bring your comment, it's a great comment, back to the model itself, that also brings us back to the importance of understanding these 2 concepts around the antecedents, the actual behaviors, and the consequence, and then more importantly, the triggers. What are the actual and the accurate triggers around that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're now listening to Rod Covert, who's not been supposed to be on that session, but since Rod has something we all know, schedule issues for travel plans, we're happy to have you with us in this session.
Well, thanks.
Oh, I should mention the title is Character Assassination and Elizabeth Holmes.
Okay, terrific. This is going to be a little bit of a different presentation, and this is kind of a case study of the application of character assassination to a person who a couple of years ago was seen to be an up-and-comer, one of those, 40 under 40. Actually, at the time, it was kind of like 30 under 30 people. Elizabeth Holmes, who is still the CEO of Theranos. This is Elizabeth Holmes at a TED Talk in which she was describing her vision for a new form of blood testing. Rather than going in and having your blood tested where you have 2, 3, 4, 5 vials maybe of blood taken out of you, what she would be able to do is just have a small amount of blood be able to be taken out and have between 30 and 35 tests actually be done on the blood. She had described during the TED Talk that the reason that she was interested in this is that she had historically been afraid of needles as a child and didn't want other people to face that kind of anxiety. Quite frankly, when I heard about this, she became one of my heroes because I hate needles and having blood taken out of me. So rather than vials, she would be able to do all of those tests and have a little bit of blood. The technology she named Edison as the blood testing technology. And as you can see, the comparison here, this is what you would typically have taken out for a number of different blood tests, when you're doing a physical and so forth. And with Edison, it would be only that amount. Their corporate and, they really only had a corporate advertising campaign. Theranos, one tiny drop changes everything. Theranos grew fairly rapidly over the course of the decade. The company was started in 2003 after Holmes dropped out of Stanford. The company was named Theranos as a combination of therapeutic and diagnostic. By 2006, Holmes had raised her first $100 million worth of venture capital. That amount hit $1 billion. That is $1 billion by 2011. She recruited a number of people, although it's kind of a curious group of people, to be members of her board of directors, including Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and our current Defense Secretary, Mad Dog Mattis, to the board of directors. And during the time, over 24 patents that were related to the blood testing technology had been awarded to Theranos. Probably the big deal that ended up coming up was that she had entered into an agreement with Walgreens where that would be a center of where the blood testing technology would take off. She also had a preliminary agreement with Safeway. And very shortly after the deal with Walgreens, the valuation of her company continued to grow, peaking in 2015 at a valuation of $9 billion. This kind of incredible growth of the company, plus just her own kind of nature, made her a kind of media darling. And so, for example, Fortune magazine, the CEO is out for blood, Elizabeth Holmes. But also, what's interesting about this title is Elizabeth Holmes and her secretive company, Theranos, aim to revolutionize healthcare. On Forbes, the Forbes 400 had her as the freshman. Elizabeth Holmes leads the class of 2014 in terms of the Forbes 400. She was often compared to Steve Jobs in particular, it was something that she did not actually try to knock down. Steve Jobs, in his latter part of his career, was known in terms of wearing black turtlenecks and so forth. So did Elizabeth Holmes. And in fact, there's only one picture that I have seen in which she's not dressed all in black, and that's when she's in a white lab coat at Theranos. Even when she goes out for any kind of social events, and this is somebody who is, a 7-day-a-week, 12 hours a day work person, she's all in black. Unfortunately, what went up went down almost as fast. In October 2015, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Holmes' net worth, since she owned 50% of the company, was $4.5 billion. At the time, she was 31 years old. In October 2016, Theranos was valued at $600 million. That is, it was valued at about 6% of what it was originally valued for, and her net worth was $0. I hope she had a lot of those black turtlenecks in her closet. What happened? Well, first, John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal published a critical piece on Theranos, wrote that the company was, from interviewing former employees, that the company was mismanaged, and more importantly, that the Edison technology was being oversold. That is, that while there was a lot that was coming out from Theranos itself, that the technology worked, nobody had actually independently verified that the technology was working. And the former employees were wondering themselves out loud to Carreyrou as to whether or not this was actually working. At just about the same time, I think John Ioannopoulos, who is a professor of medicine at Penn, wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association that conceptually he could not figure out how you would be able to take that little amount of blood and be able to do the number of tests that you can get. And he explained it in far more detail than I could even hope to understand. But apparently it has to do with the viscosity of the blood and how you can break it down and so forth. Shortly thereafter, in February of 2016, the FDA launched an investigation of the labs and issued a report about 6 weeks later that suggested that the nanotechnology that was driving Edison, that they were critical of it. But more importantly, they were critical of the quality control of the labs. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS, also went and launched an investigation and verified the same thing. In fact, found that the quality control at the Atlantic City, or the New Jersey lab and the Arizona lab were both substandard and recommended that they be closed. And then ultimately, the one in Silicon Valley also faced the same recognition. In August of 2016, Holmes had brought in a number of investors and people that were health reporters to show that the technology works, but that demonstration was unconvincing to both audiences. In addition, Holmes didn't always help herself. When asked how exactly did Edison work, her response was, and if anybody can kind of figure this out, could you let me know? A chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical interaction with the sample, which is translated into a result, which is then reviewed by certified laboratory personnel. I hope that's as all clear to you as it's muddled to me. Also, Holmes could be very secretive and defensive. And in fact, when there would be negative press, she launched her legal team after them threatening them. She even hired David Boies for a while to be chief legal counsel. But this is kind of indicative of her responses. When asked if she had any kind of backup plan if Edison didn't work, she said, the minute you have a backup plan, you've admitted that you're not going to succeed, which was the headline of Stanford Business. Now, there's a lot of things that you can look at in terms of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. For this particular conference, I was interested in the really just almost vicious personal attack on her. There were attacks about the technology, attacks about her leadership ability and so forth, but between the business press and social media, there were a number of different things that were launched against her that were really bordered on ugly. And I think it may have something to do with the fact that when you have a company that's so identified by its leader, that when you're getting at the company, you're also getting at the leader and attacking him that way. But just to give you an idea of some of the things that the business press and social media ended up talking about, one business article had talked about Elizabeth Holmes' gigantic lies and how much of a big liar that she was. That she led a cult of employees at Theranos. That she was a Steve Jobs wannabe, not just in terms of dress, but also in terms of attitude. That she was a scam artist. That was across a number of business publications, from the Wall Street Journal to Fortune magazine. Also, it was very interesting to see, she had been at least 3 times, there were major profile pieces in Vanity Fair. And in 2015, it was very laudatory. Last fall, basically, they were also calling her a scam artist. That she doesn't care about patients and patients' health. One attack said that the apple doesn't fall far from the trees, and had accused her father of also being a scam artist, of which there's really no validity to that, but I guess somebody didn't like her dad. My favorite was, and this came from social media, she will soon discover that orange is the new black. In other words, that she was going to go to prison, and also basing that off of the popular book and series, Orange is the New Black. One of the, there is on the NPR website, if you go to Theranos, there's a whole comic about Theranos, the rise and fall of a healthcare tech unicorn. A unicorn in the tech business is something that looks like it's really great, but it's really only fantasy. And so she's been called the world's youngest female self-made billionaire. Now her company is facing a federal criminal investigation. She had very few supporters. The only one that got on a number of the press shows and was covered in interviews was Tim Draper. He said, people don't want vampires taking gallons of their blood every time they get tested. Elizabeth Holmes is a great example of maybe why the women are so frustrated. She's a woman entrepreneur who built a fabulous company, did great things for consumers, and she got attacked. Of course, since he was the one who gave her first million, maybe there's just a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on there. As we saw this morning on the, in terms of the Austrian and German CEOs, integrity was the attribute most often attacked and was most highly correlated with retention in office. So it's not surprising that attacks in the business press and social media were designed to undermine Holmes's integrity. But this becomes important because if Elizabeth Holmes is a talented but too young CEO, overmatched by leading a company promoting a disruptive technology, then investors might be reassured if there are changes to the management of the company. What happens if the adults come in to run things, for example? On the other hand, if Elizabeth Holmes is a scam artist, then who's going to invest in her company? And if Holmes is a scam artist, how likely is it that the FDA will approve any further Theranos devices, including improvements to Edison? What if she's right? What if Edison, or an improvement on Edison, is a revolution in blood testing that can dramatically reduce one element of healthcare costs? Something that we might not see because of the assassination of Holmes's character.
Almost pitch perfect. Thank you very much. So we have time for 2 questions, please.
You probably made this point really clear, but let me ask again. What was the very first incident that started this off? What happened to start moving against her ethos? What was the events?
It was Piraeus' article in the Wall Street
That
Journal.
article was
You could, if you were looking at positive versus negative press, I remember reading within 2 days a piece in I think it was Business Insider about the valuation of her company. She was getting more, investors. They were thinking of, doing an IPO. And then 2 days later, I read the Wall Street Journal piece and going, wow, talk about turning 180 degrees, because it was a tough piece. And after that, basically I'd say that within 60 days there was a complete change, because a lot of pieces in magazines are, written in advance of publication. But easily by the first of the year, all of the press was going downhill. And it just, piled on because, there was bad press, and then there was the FDA investigation and more bad press, and then the failed demonstration in August, and more bad press, and they have to lay off employees. Today, Theranos is still a thriving concern, but there's $200 million on cash that they have, and there are multiple legal suits against Theranos. And so, basically, Wall Street has kind of like a death count. When are they going to put it out of business? And so, yeah. Oh.
Well, I was curious about the timing and how much of broader trends that might be happening, because when you were talking about this, I was also reminded of the Martin Shkreli,
right,
the one who raised prices on drugs overnight, and he was obviously held accountable for that. But to what extent does sort of the larger context of things like that may be happening in similar time frames affect the kind of ferocity that might have happened here?
I have a number of friends who are in the pharmaceutical industry, and almost to a person they hate her. And they lump her in with Shkreli, and they lump her in with the people at Valiant. And because what is happening is that you have the kind of legacy pharmaceutical companies, your Mercks and your Pfizers and your BMSs and so on, where they put a lot of money into research and development. They get a patent on drug. They have to go through the 3 phases of the trials. Maybe they have 6 years on their patent to make a bunch of money. But now what you're having are people like Shkreli, who are hedge fund people, who come in and buy a drug, have no intention of doing any research and development, are going to milk the drug or set of drugs for whatever it's worth, and then get out. And so, first thing that he does is for that toxoplasmosis drug, he raises the price from $200 a dose to $1,400 a dose, whatever the market will bear. Even though, ironically, the pharmaceutical industry is doing more tech stuff, somebody like Elizabeth Holmes, who's is kind of like new to the game, is looked down upon, and is kind of like, oh, she doesn't really have any healthcare background, that type of thing. Or Valiant, when they end up buying the so-called female Viagra. And they're just buying the drug. They're not doing any research and development on things. And so there's a shift that's going on in the pharmaceutical industry. It is really a pivot point, because a lot of the big profitable drugs either have had their patent expire or are about to go off patent. You've got all of the generics that are coming into play. And there's no big multi-billion-dollar drug out there. Cardiovascular is pretty much tapped out. CNS, central nervous system, The only big play is Alzheimer's. They don't even have a theory for Alzheimer's yet. So it's, there's a lot of changes, a lot of people that are, really scared and angry about it. That's probably way more information than you wanted to know about.
So, thank you very much.
Okay.
And, the United States is concerned with Trump. Europe is especially concerned with a lot of accents. So we're now going to have a very interesting presentation, I hope, on something that's been troubling at least Europeans for quite a long time now, for 6-7 years. And it's Samaras, Athanasios, together with Kolovos, Kyriakos, on quantifying the ad hominem argument in parliamentary discussion. So let's check.
Okay.
No, that's not potential.
Hello. You cannot see me, but you can listen. Even though I'm not sure if it's okay. I do apologize for my thick Greek accent, but I love it. And I don't know what to do without it. Quantifying that hominem argument. Ethos, the character of the orator, ethotic argument, the kind of argument or technique in which ethos is involved either positively or negatively, negativity, rhetorical attack, any criticism leveled by one candidate against another during the campaign. Ad hominem or negative ethotic argument is a rhetorical strategy that combines attack with ethos in order to deconstruct the credibility of the opponent. Thus we are at the core of the character assassination toolbox. I have done a lot of research in political advertising in Greece. I have worked with the elements of video style codebook. I have worked with the Benoit functional typology codebook. A negative ethotic argument is out there, but even though character is a very important issue in political advertising, negative ethotic arguments have not been integrated into this literature. Why? Because it is next to impossible to integrate them into a codebook. So in order to test hypotheses, you need to quantify. But you cannot quantify by using a codebook in a traditional manner. So what I'm going to present to you is a methodology that we are using a qualitative manner in order to analyze the material, and then we are quantifying upon this qualitative process. It's very simple, and I think effective. We are analyzing, we have done 5 case studies. I'm going to refer to three of these case studies. Lagarde list in the Greek Parliament, the Grexit debate in the Greek Parliament, and Brexit debate in the House of Commons UK. In all 3 occasions, the rhetoric is pertained by ethos and negativity, or should be pertained. The situational and rhetorical context of each event is ideal for analyzing the employment of the ad hominem argument, where negativity is employed at the personal level in order to undermine the ethos of a political subject. Dear old Walton, I'm capitalizing upon his work. He has done all the... This is his typology. Abusive ad hominem argument, from veracity, from prudence, from perception, from cognitive skills, from morals. The argument structure is very important because it's the manner according to which we can identify the kind of ad hominem argument that they are employing. Premise and conclusion, the circumstantial ad hominem argument, major premise, person A advocates argument X, which has a proportion Y at its conclusion. A has carried out an action or set of actions that imply that A is personally committed not to Y or to the opposite of Y. Therefore, A is a bad person, therefore the argument X should not be accepted. Okay. The bias ad hominem argument. Too loud? I'm sorry. Occurs where critic questions the impartiality of an arguer. It is an allegation that the other party in the dialogue is engaged in self-interest advocacy rather than an open inquiry that takes all relevant evidence into account. The bias ad hominem argument is metacommunicative in nature and is particularly relevant as a delegitimation strategy in the parliamentary discussion, especially in parliamentary discussions about inquiry committees and the operation of the inquiry committees, where by definition they don't have to do advocacy, but they have to be engaged into critical inquiry. So we have an adversarial type of dialogue, we have critical inquiry, and there is a dialectic shift of illicit type, when a participant is supposed to be engaged in an inquiry, when some grounds indicated he's shifting to an adversarial dispute. So I'm an academic. I'm supposed to do critical inquiry. If I'm involved in advocacy, I'm a politician, I'm not academic, I'm not free from academia. This is the reason why we kick PhD candidates out in Greece, because they do advocacy instead of critical inquiry. But then they become politicians, so what can we do? The bias ad hominem argument, person A, the proponent of argument is biased. Person A's bias is a failure to take part honestly in a type of dialogue which includes argument. Therefore, he's a bad person. Therefore, he cannot participate. He is not credible. The bias ad hominem argument, when the bias is a permanent attribute and not something that just happens, is a poison the well. Poisoning the well ad hominem argument. The bias is hardened. That means that we can never trust this person. This person cannot be trusted to be impartial or open-minded ever. Thus, ancient Greek used to say, "Uk me pisis, can me pisis." You cannot persuade me, even if you persuade me. So, if the other person is in this state of mind, we have no reason to talk with him. So, with poisoning the well ad hominem argument, we don't have a ground to communicate with the other person. Thus, civic dialogue collapses. And this is one of the most poisonous ad hominem arguments. And unfortunately, the most often used in Greece. Very often used in Greece, indeed. So, the poisoning well, for every argument, not for just one argument, for every argument he is biased, his failure to take part honestly, blah, blah, blah. So we cannot be involved in a discussion with this person. He is excluded from the discussion. If you have bias ad hominem argument, poisoning the well ad hominem argument within the parliament, this is a parliament that does not communicate with another. You don't have a public sphere. Goodbye. And also I have noticed a lot of this sort of bias in the Clinton versus Trump rhetoric, but this is not my country. What can I say? And even worse, the poisoning the well by alleging group bias argument. Person A has argued for thesis A, but belongs to or is affiliated with group G. If he is known that group G is a special interest partisan group, it takes up a biased, dogmatic, prejudicial, fanatical, quarreling attitude in pushing exclusively for its own point of view. Therefore, one cannot engage in open-minded critical discussion of an issue with any member of this group. Question, very important question. When I find poisoning the well by alleging group bias argument, what is the more important, the bias or the group? That means I'm employing the group as a counter-conditioning process in order to harden the bias, or I'm using the concept of the bias in order to deconstruct an outer group and place my opponent there. This is a very important question. It's not a rhetorical question. We're not splitting hairs here. So, Greece, financial crisis in effect changed the party system totally. We have two parties, the Conservative Party and the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party went down from 40% to 14%. I don't know why they should have vanished into thin air. because they were responsible for getting the country into EMU and under the political control of Germany and turning the country in the German protectorate, which actually functions here, a colony of death, as it is called in the Greek rhetoric. And Lagarde list, Inquiry Committee, is a spreadsheet containing names of Greek depositors of the HSBC Bank of Geneva branch. These people, chances are that they have put their money illegally out, and they have to explain where they found the money. Mr. Papakonstantinou, an ex-minister of economics and recipient of the list, had three of his relatives removed by the list and then do nothing with the containment of the list. So we have 3 parliamentary discussions. These parliamentary discussions are very strong on ethos, are very strong on negativity, and they're very strong in reconstructing the groupings. We have a situation where the old regime is collapsing and the new regime has not formed yet. Blame games, accusations, and apologies are rhetorical components of the parliamentary discussion. In order for blame to be attributed, speakers enter the process of constructing and often demonizing groups employing the propagandistic technique, of Grand Falloon. The rhetoric is pertained by ethos and negativity. The situation, blah blah, only 5 minutes left. Qualitative rhetorical analysis. In this analysis, we are only identifying the bias at hominem arguments. In the other 2 analyses, we are identifying all forms of arguments. We find the part of the text that we suppose that it contains an ad hominem. Then we're trying to find the premises and the conclusions of the ad hominem. Then we're trying to tautologize to find the identity of the particular ad hominem based on the list of Walton. And then we also find who says is the target, etc. 3 people are doing this process independently. Then we compare and contrast, and we found the reliability. Thus, it is evident what we have done. Well, I know it Greeks to you, but this is the matrix that we are employing. The text, etc. Greek text, Greek analysis, what can we do? That's like. Bias ad hominem, poison the well ad hominem, group bias ad hominem, fair discussion, 82.8% group bias ad hominem. And this is a negativity matrix, source versus target. What is very important here, one moment. Well, conservative government, socialist government, left-wing party, or the coalition government pro-memorandum. He does not attack PASOK, where prior to 2010 they would kill each other. They attack the socialist, the Pinky party that becomes the government, 62%, PASOK saying 78%. Golden Dawn neo-Nazi party. So on the other hand, Syriza, which is now the government, and Tarnel, which is a right-wing anti-memorandum party, they attack the governmental parties and the government. So actually what we have here, can you hear me? What we have here is the first evidence of the reconstruction of the bipolar contradistinction, the grammar of bipolar opposition that characterized Greek politics 1974 until 2010. And now we see to re-emerge in a multi-party system again. Brexit. We are analyzing in the British Parliament, House of Commons, 12 parliamentary discussions prior to Brexit, 12 parliamentary discussions post-Brexit. Why 24? Because English people do not use ad hominem. I don't know why. One parliamentary discussion in Greece, one parliamentary discussion, 361 ad hominem arguments. 24 parliamentary discussions in Britain, 173 ad hominem arguments, all 24 of these. I don't know what they're doing there. Well, even better, Pre-referendum, post-referendum, 22.3%, 40 out of 179 ad hominems prior to the referendum, 77.8%, 139 ad hominems post-referendum. They were sleeping, then after the referendum they woke up, they realized that they have a Brexit, and they start fighting each other. Remainer, those who have lost the campaign, after they have lost the campaign, they go bananas, and they have 111 ad hominem arguments. Very important thing, exactly the same situation we have in Greece. What happens in Greece? In Greece, the people who lost the election attacked viciously those who win the elections. However, in Greece, they did it before the campaign, before the results, while in Britain, in Brexit, they've done after the result. Why? Because Remainers thought that they would win, while the supporters of the Yes know that they were going to lose. So the loser is using ad hominem argument. Target, also very important, we have two different logics. One logic is the campaign. One logic is the logic of the campaign mode. In the party politics of UK. The party politics of the UK is until here. It's something like 87%. The other thing is the campaign mode related with foreign policy, attacks on other nations. Spain on Gibraltar, EU, just okay. No Germany at all, I cannot understand this. Even though Germany is at fault for Brexit, as for the collapse of the European Union, as for Brexit, as for the future election of Marine Le Pen, blah, blah, blah. But now I'm doing politics, so I shouldn't. Or maybe I should. Okay. I have so many things to say. So many papers. We have done an analysis on presidential discussion in Cyprus. We have done analysis, a comparative analysis in parliamentary discussions and news in Greece on an anarchist who tried to escape from anywhere. And we are doing all the time new analysis. I just want to show you the manner that this is done. We have done similar analysis with Benoit strategies in different parliamentary discussions. And we have done also, we have operationalized in this manner attribution theory. And we have examined the blame games and how different parties with different positions are using the blame games. Actually, what we are doing is I'm using very often the term of campaign mode. Campaign mode implies as a black box. We do not know what happens within the campaign, what decisions they're making, but we know the output, which is the content analysis of the attributes of the messages produced by a campaign. And we can imagine the input, the positions that they are in, being in government or out of government, in front or behind the elections, in the polls, having particular events that have a strong negative actualization, all issues of political culture, and we are trying to relate the independent variables of the conditions that affect the rhetorical topic, the key topic available to the orator, available to the party, and the output. By relating the input and the output, the independent and the dependent variable, we end up with the laws of propaganda, the laws of strategic communication. Treason and Friedenberg, many analysts in relation to negativity have developed such models in the USA. In Greece and in Europe, most European countries, due to economic financial crisis and the hegemonic projection of Germany, the projection of hegemonic power of Germany, and the deconstruction of Europe because of these two events, we are facing a totally different rate of independent variables that affects the media content, affects strategic considerations. Also, I'll take one more minute, okay, I'm good.
Speaking of German
Hegemony, yes. Challenging. Thank you. One final thing. There is something that I didn't hear in this conference at all. And it is very, 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 very relevant indeed. Engelhardt and Norris left behind thesis as an interpretative frame for Trump, for Brexit, for Marine Le Pen in France, for Brexit, for all the nice, ugly things, but very interesting analytically, that they are coming towards. What is the relation of the left behind thesis with ad hominem argument? What is the relation? How the left behind thesis, how the left behind mentality, and the vengeance of the left behind affect the way that they're perceiving messages and the effectiveness of character assassination? Because if I'm left behind and I know the feeling of being left behind, I want blood. I need blood. Anything less than blood is not enough for me. So help me God. Thank you. Any questions? Okay.
Again, I think it's better than to try to scream. Thank you for a great presentation. It's really educative. And I think that ad hoc arguments are extremely important in politics and ancient politics and contemporary as well. But that seems quite problematic for me is that originally the typology and definition come from, they both come from philosophy, from the discourse inside of academia, right? And from rhetorics of trials, of public speeches, and so on. So the problem is how is it possible to provide any more or less rigid methodology how to define between the direct attack, which is pure ad hominem argument, and ironical, sarcastical, indirect attack. Say, when I speak about someone that person is not educated enough to understand the topic properly, it's ad hominem attack. Then I admire by the education of this person who is right, smart personality, and so on. But I give a hint that because of the very high level, this person cannot understand some ground topics. It's another way to speak, to say the same, basically. But is it possible to call that type of arguments? How do you work with it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Walton has done a very good work into creating a typology of ad hominem. And with this particular methodology that we are focusing, we are always trying to do grounded work and find new types of ad hominem arguments. Heavens forbid, I haven't found one yet. But I'm always looking for a new item that could enhance, increase the typology, etc. What you are saying is also very important, the relation of content and context. But we are operating, we are analyzing cultures that we are aware of. So when someone is sarcastic, but by being sarcastic, he's mobilizing an ad hominem argument. Within my culture, I can perceive it and realize. Though most cases, ad hominem arguments are very strong, because we have discussions that are very heated, and the management of ethos is very, very strong. Also, another thing. Critical theory, argumentation theory provide us with 3 to 4 different critical questions for every type of ad hominem argument. These critical questions are very, very useful in order, can be employed in order to deconstruct a negative attack. Ad hominem has a problem. If you attack my ethos, then I attack your ethos. Then we are going to cut each other's throat. We don't have a civilized discussion. The point is with the critical questions, you can answer to the ad hominem in such a manner as not to destroy the discussion. And these are very interesting seals to the character assassination attacks. And this is one of the two manners, and they can be used discursively. The point is, how can you educate a person to recognize that hominem attack real time, and then mobilize the critical question that diffuse the attack? How can you do such a thing? You let this person find that hominem argument, so he knows the hominem argument the moment he hears it. And we do this sort of training in the strategic communication and new media laboratory in Piraeus. Thank you very much. I can speak forever, believe me.
So, thank you very much, Professor. And we're coming to the conclusion of this panel. And we're staying in Greece. And Neofytos, did I get it right? Neofytos Aspriadis will talk about the process of Greece's demonization and Schäuble's discourse during the Greek Memorandum renegotiation. So, okay, here we go.
So, good afternoon. Very nice and interesting presentation so far. My name is Aspriadis Neofytos. I'm from the University of Piraeus of Greece and the Strategic Communications and News Media Laboratory. And as a background in international relations, I wanted to go the character assassination a step further and examine what happens if political leaders attack countries directly, and in a way they make a country assassination. So we have no character to assassinate, but a country. The case study focuses on the first semester of 2015, where we had in Greece a new government after the January 2015 elections, which was a leftist government. A few years ago, a 3% government, a 3% party, and became government in January 2015. And with the promise to renegotiate the deal from the previous governments in order to gain a better economic deal basically for Greece. So it began a heated rhetoric against Germany, against the European Union. It attributed basically outside factors in order to rally the interior. So in this context, the German Minister of Economy tried to deconstruct the Greek rhetoric in order to rally the other European members around him and strengthen his position. So the research, this particular research, focuses on the discourse of Schäuble and the image formation attitudes, the demonization and the blame games he used to construct a specific image for Greece in order to achieve his diplomatic goals. The methodology we used is the qualitative content analysis in the Schäuble's discourse for a period of 5 months until June 2015. So we came up with the research questions: how are the procedures of personification and personalization employed in Schäuble's discourse? How is responsibility attributed to Greece regarding the causes of the financial crisis? And how is the image of Greece being formed through the strategies used by Schäuble? So the theoretical framework goes as to the metaphors, which are a figure of speech which makes an implicit, implied or hidden comparison between two things that are unrelated but share some common characteristics. So since metaphors basically reflect a particular way of thinking, they cannot be replaced by non-metaphorical concepts at least without significant loss of meaning. So, as Lakoff-Johnson suggests, as human beings, we live by metaphors. Our lives are based on metaphors that make up our worldview. We inherit our metaphors, our perception is formed by metaphors, and it is very hard to recognize them and change them. Only by creating a new metaphor can we overcome other metaphors. So the cognitive linguistics upgraded the use of metaphors from ways of expression to worldviews. And metaphors are a cognitive tool, which means it applies to reason. So, personification is the most frequently used metaphor. It allows attribution of human motivations, characteristics, and properties to more abstract concepts. It allows the person to identify itself more easily with concepts that have similarities with it. It forms understandings of the world under human terms and facilitates generalizations, but also creates stereotypes and entrenched images. Personification, on the other hand, we have the state as an abstract concept, is often understood by means of integration process, which is the embodiment, and personalization and personification. By thinking the state as a person, we attribute to it a series of data that stem from people's characteristics such as intention, logic, personality, and identity. These components are produced by the way the institutions function, the way people form images in their minds and for other countries, and the strategic communication of political actors, which is intentional. So Wendt used three levels of personification, which is the leadership, which leaders often use their personal prestige to enhance the image of their country, and but on the other hand, the state itself is incorporated usually in the leader's figure. We saw it in a lot of leaders that is happening. The institution, the Parliament, the Commission, the European Commission, institutions, which is basically the institutional embodiment, and the people or social groups, which are the Greek people, in general, the Europeans, Americans, etc. So, the rhetoric of blame now, or the blame game, which is being initiated after crisis, refers to the process of attribution of responsibility that arises after a failure or crisis. In such a case, actors typically try to deflect their own part of responsibility by shifting the blame to other actors. By attributing responsibility to a personified state, the blame functions as instrument of domestication of failure that stems from the state's internal and stable characteristics. Thus, the personified state is self-accountable for the failure or crisis, and external factors affecting or causing the failure are not examined. Let's see now Schäuble's rhetoric during the Greek negotiations. First of all, Schäuble tried to attack three different levels. The first was Greece as a country, the second was the Greek government and its leadership, and the third was the Greek citizens, the Greeks in general. So he says that Greece has recently made its own situation difficult through its rhetoric. So Schäuble is referring to Greece as a person. He uses cultural differences to explain his argument, and this way he attacks Greece directly, presenting it as irresponsible and irrational, because one cannot live permanently over its own capacity. This is an argument he used many times. Greece has long lived beyond its own capacity until the outbreak of the crisis. Greece cannot decide alone in Europe which way is the right way. So he tries basically this way to deconstruct the arguments of Greece through the deconstruction of its image and through blaming. It blames Greece, first of all, that they mismanaged economics all these years through. And of course, he blames also Greece because they wanted, the new government wanted to change the deal with its own terms and didn't want to comply with any other less than what it wanted to achieve. So Schäuble moves on and attacks directly the Greek government. It would be helpful if the government in Greece did not speak in such a way that makes it difficult for us, the rest of the Europeans, to persuade our people to help Greece. So he uses the otherness. He uses us and them. We, the rest of the Europeans. He constructs the otherness, the enemy image, by using this default. And he says that can the Greek government be trusted or not? There are lots of doubt regarding this in Germany. Since this government has been in office, the situation is getting worse. And he says, yes, of course, we have great respect for the election outcome of the Greeks, which was an argument. But my respect for the German voters and the voters in every other member countries is just as great. And you have to find a way. But it is not easy to say, well, we do not stick to what we have agreed on, but we need money. So the Greek government is being presented as untrustworthy and inefficient. Germany tries to influence the European community to view Greece negatively through the demonization of its government. He attacks also the leadership and Prime Minister Cyprus directly. He said he spoke to him at some point regarding his promises to the Greek people, saying that if you promise these things in an election campaign, I can only wish you personally that you never win the election. And now, the people are being incited by false promises. Someone should say that. Hopes are made, and at the same time it is said that others are to blame for the debt problem. This has little to do with the truth. So he tries to say that the Greek leadership is lying not only to the Greek people, but to Europe as well. And finally, he attacks the Greeks. Oh, you know, I do not have the intention, when other people behave badly, to change my own habits. And if you have the responsibility of a finance minister, personal sensitivities are not really important. That's not what it is about. It's all about essence. I feel sorry for the Greeks. They have chosen a government that is quite irresponsible at the moment. We want solidarity, but not blackmail. Nobody has imposed the aid program on the Greeks. It is therefore entirely in the hands of the government in Athens. So we have on the one side the responsible Schäuble and versus the irresponsible Greeks. So who would you trust? Greeks deserve what they get because it was their choice to vote for this government. The people are being identified with the country and they are also blamed and covered with negativity. I suspect that it is also a great poker game of this new government. You can always easily promise people, blame others when others have to pay. He demonized the government, he deconstructs its arguments, it's a negotiating efficiency by saying a great poker game. The Greek government is playing probably, and this way he deconstructs the rhetoric, and all together, all these things, he tries to attack or to kill the country's image. So Schäuble attributes responsibility to the people of Greece for electing irresponsible governments and for living beyond their capacities. He attributes responsibility to the new prime minister for deceiving the Greek people and the government for the negotiating strategy and tactics it used. Schäuble aims at deconstructing the arguments of Greece and rally the member states of the Eurogroup around him. His attacks are leveled in 4 stages. First, he attacks Greece as a state. Secondly, he attacks the government, institutional embodiment. Then he attacks the leadership, personification. Finally, he attacks the Greeks as a group attack. By doing this escalation, Schäuble identifies the state with its different parts by making use of personification. The government represents the state and does not differ from it. This identification, through the deconstruction of the nation image, allows him to deconstruct also the government's arguments. Greece is not being presented in terms of a victim, but in terms of a victimizer. This helps the demonization of the negotiation process and delegitimizes the attempt and the argumentation of the new government. The country assassination is being achieved in terms of changing the attitudes of the other member states towards Greece in that particular moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Well, then I have a question or a comment. Do you really think that this is a form of character assassination? Because from me being German and having followed the discourse for 7 years now, I mean, it all started in 2010 already when the Merkel government labeled it as a debt crisis and making perfectly sure that they thought the people who are responsible for the debt are those who have to find a solution to this. But I have the feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Schäuble was so successful in doing this just because there's a deep-seated kind of stereotype about Greece and southern Mediterranean countries in the German public. So it's not that Schäuble came up with this image and constructed it. Me personally living there, I think there is some sort of deep racist sentiment in the German, probably there is in every country in the world, but there's some sort of sentiment, and that's why it could work. And I don't know if this is really like, I think it may be just one piece of a larger process of character assassination. So what's your idea or opinion on that?
Yeah, I think that, so I think that our story with Germany goes back in the Second World War.
Even longer.
Yeah.
But the fact is that you're right, it all started back in 2010 with the crisis. Of course, the crisis started then, but what happened in this particular case is that at least in the Greek discourse, things changed. Basically, all this is a process of evolution of the crisis. So it mainly changed not the paradigm, it changed the situation, because we tried to stick at first, because of course we have our own responsibility on the handling of the crisis and the image of the country. And what happened is that at first, in the beginning of the crisis, some Greek politicians tried to get along with Europe, and they destroyed somehow the image of Greece by sticking to that what you said about the PIC countries, which are the countries of South. I'm explaining to American friends, which are the countries of the South Europe. And so the thing is that after that, the destruction of the image, there was some attempts to make our image even better and get along with the Europeans. So in January 2015, everything changes because this new government tries to swipe everything out and say, I don't care what everyone else did until now, now I will do something new. And it started a rhetoric. I don't say that Schäuble started first or whoever. The thing is that the new government started a new rhetoric and blamed Germany for all these years of difficult economic times in Greece. So, and used an argumentation basically against Germany. So in this context, basically, Schäuble tries to answer through these arguments. It is one-sided. The research, the particular research is one-sided, and it tries to deconstruct the argumentation of the Greeks, and that's why he uses this means of character assassination.
So we have to wait for the other side for the next character assassination.
Yeah, I have already the research doing both.
Okay.
But
so the final comment, please.
Yes. As a co-author, not actually as a comment, I'm one of the three co-authors. We have a paradigmatic shift in Germany in the way they are projecting the image since 2010. Ever since the end of the Second World War, Germany, though powerful financially, does not project the image of power. They start projecting the image of power since 2009. And this is due to a Prime Minister of Germany coming from East Germany and having no feelings of shame for Second World War, Holocaust, and all these things.
You would be careful with that.
Yes, but there is a very strong projections of power. We have done different media content analysis on state mapping, demonstrating these projections of power. We have done analysis on the representation of Cyprus during the financial crisis of 2030 in the German political discourse, where there are similar processes of demonization, victimization, in order to legitimate several processes. The problem with this projection of power, and it's not a projection of a problem of Greece, a problem of Germany, this form of projection of power creates anti-hegemonic coalitions. And these anti-hegemonic coalitions with the German power result to the First World War, to the Second World War, and now it is going to result to the deconstruction of Europe if Le Pen gets elected in France. Europe, bye-bye. I mean, it's the end of the European project.
Okay, then we leave it at that. Thank you very much. Again, I guess we're almost on schedule, are we?
I guess our moderator deserves a free beer today. Thank you.
Okay, then running joke, short coffee break.
We are coffee at the station.